This is Dr. Darty recording part 2 of bones. Let's see if I can show you what I went to the kitchen to get. I wanted to illustrate for you the different types of fractures. So I went to get some breadsticks. I was hoping I had the fat kind, but I don't. Very long, thin bone. But we just said that one of the most important things to know is a fracture open or closed. Open fracture is where the ends poke through the skin, and that's considered a compound fracture. A closed is sometimes called a simple fracture, where both ends of the bone, or as many pieces of the bone there as were fractured, stay inside the skin. Really important. After that, another way that we describe fractures is displaced and non-displaced. So I've just snapped this very skinny, let's say, femur. You can see I have two ends here. Let's see if I can get it closer to you like that. And if it is non-displaced, you'd really have to look, it's in your way, really hard. It's got it displaced a little. There we go. That's pretty much, see if I can get it over here to the other side where you can see it better. If you look, you can see that tiny crack through the breadstick. You can see how that might get missed on an x-ray, especially if I had it really non-displaced. There's a tiny crack there. But you can see it would be much easier to see that something's wrong if the two ends of the bones did not still align properly and it were displaced, really displaced. Even displaced a little bit. You can see that's a whole different problem because those two ends are not necessarily going to grow back together properly. We might end up with a residual deformity. So we want to know, is a fracture displaced or non-displaced? Let me turn my notes over here so I can make sure I don't miss anything there. All right, another thing you want to know is how many parts are there. If you have a lot of parts of the bone, we might see this, say, in a high-impact automobile accident where someone really tried to hit the gas and their lower leg took the whole impact of the trauma. This may be sort of what happened to Tiger Woods. I don't know about his situation. But what you might see in that situation, and I'm going to try to illustrate that with a much thicker femur. I just went and raided the cracker box. You see if I can make a comminuted fracture for you. I'm going to have a lot to clean up here after a while. Sesame seeds everywhere. Okay. Do you see, let's see if I can kind of hold it together, that this bone now, this bone now has pieces, more than two pieces. If I had an extra hand, whoops, wrong way, more, you would see that there were maybe 3 or 4 pieces, some of which are still lying on my desk. I don't know if I can do that with these breadsticks or not. Let's see if I can. Yeah, well, maybe. Okay. Can you see that now we have within my fingers, oh, we're losing pieces of our bone. We don't want that to happen in real life. But if we have a comminuted fracture, instead of just a bone broken with one end, here's another end, there are pieces of bone. That's where the orthopedic surgeons have to get really busy. And you may have had people, friends, or maybe you, have had a comminuted fracture where the only way to get the ends properly aligned to encourage healing was to put in a plate with screws or wires. They have a lot of fancy hardware and a lot of nifty tricks. Sometimes they use cadaver bone if you're missing a piece of the puzzle, so to speak. But a comminuted fracture is generally a more serious and a more complex kind of fracture than one where we simply have a displaced or non-displaced with the two ends of the bone still at least in the same room. There are a lot of other things, children, and I don't have something to illustrate that. I could have brought a cheese stick, I suppose, a long piece of cheese. You know, you can sometimes bend a bone and it is disrupted on one side but not the other side. And the name is aptly chosen, a green stick fracture. You know what that is. If you pick up a green stick out in the yard, not a brittle one that's been lying there forever, but one that just came off the tree, and you try to snap it, it often breaks on one side, but is still connected on the other side. And that's called a green stick fracture. Maybe I can do one more. I don't know if this will work or not. Spiral fractures are pretty common too. We see those in sports injuries when a football quarterback plants his foot and the cleats are holding his foot in the ground, and then he gets hit from the side in a twisting way, then we get what's called a spiral fracture. Toddlers get those because when they're learning to walk, they get their toes caught on the corner of a table when they go by, but they keep moving, and as they fall, it breaks in a spiral pattern. I believe there's a picture of one in your book. I'm not sure I can do a spiral fracture. Yeah, it's a pretty good spiral fracture, actually. If I twisted, everything's right and left, it's hard. So if I twisted it, you can see that I kind of got like that. It twisted. And that's a spiral fracture. So one of the interesting things as you get used to looking at x-rays is to see if you can determine what type of fracture you're dealing with. I believe your book makes the point, if not they should. That's why you always need at least 2 views for an x-ray to be considered adequate. It should get the joint above and below the bone, but it also should get an AP, anterior posterior, remember we learned that, and a lateral view, a view from the side, to give it a more complete idea of how the bone broke and how the ends are aligned. You often hear people complain about, well, I took them to the ER and it was broken, but they missed it. It's not always simple to see a fracture. If a fracture is non-displaced, if we have what we call a buccal fracture, common in children also, and older people, common during the winter when people fall on their outstretched hand, and the bone doesn't break apart, but it gets impacted on itself. It sort of gets like a can when you step on it, but not completely flat. That's another type of fracture. So there are many types of fractures. Your book lists several, but they're really fun to learn about. All right. Then your book, after it's told you all this, decides to tell you what the bones are and where they are. So we'll go along with that. It first talks about the axial skeleton, and that's, not surprisingly, the bones that make up the central or axial section of your body, the main part, the part that is not the extremities. We would say commonly your arms and legs, but since we're in a sort of anatomy class, your upper and lower limb. But your axial skeleton consists of your skull and your vertebrae and your ribs and your sternum. That makes up your axial skeleton. So let's talk just for a second about your skull. People tend to use the words skull and cranium interchangeably, but that's not really right. Your cranium is the top part of your skull that houses your brain. There's an interesting mnemonic how you can remember the names of those bones. I'm not going to ask you to parrot them back to me, but you might want to know sometime, so give me a second, I'll write it out for you. The mnemonic for the bones that make up the cranium, the top part of your skull that holds your brain, is pest of 6. Now clearly, pest of 6 doesn't mean anything sensible, but I'll show you how it works. The 6 tells you that there are 6 bones that make up the cranium. It's very hard to get used to things being backwards. Pest of 6. So P is for your parietal bones, the big flat ones on the side. E is for your ethmoid bone, up there behind your nose in the floor of your skull. You don't see it unless something very bad has happened. S is for the sphenoid, a butterfly-shaped bone that makes up your most of the floor of your cranium. T is for your temporal bone, at your temporals, around your ears here, your middle ear cavity and inner ear cavity are there. O is for your occipital bone, the hard back part of your head. And F is for your frontal bone, or forehead, which is also the frontal region of your body. So pest of 6 tells you the 6 cranial bones, and that's a good little mnemonic to know. I'm not testing you on that, but I thought you might want to know. All right, we come on down to the rest of the skull, and that's your facial bones. There are a lot of those, and their names are not always familiar to people outside of healthcare. Many people know your mandible or lower jaw. It's the only one that doesn't have a bony connection to the rest of the skull. And you might be aware of that because if you heard people have TMJ problems, that stands for temporomandibular joint. The tissue, that soft tissue that joins the temporal bone of the skull to the mandible gets inflamed, that joint, and causes problems when they chew. So a TMJ problem, which is pretty common, dentists actually recognize that quite frequently. So TMJ stands for temporomandibular joint, and your lower jaw is your mandible. Your upper jaw is the maxilla. Your cheekbones or your zygoma, your nasal bone. You probably could have figured that one out. If you break your nose, you've broken your nasal bone. And there's some other smaller ones that I certainly wouldn't ask you to learn right now. There's a long mnemonic for that. Virgil cannot make my pet zebra laugh. Again, nonsensical, but the initials for those words remind you of the first letter of all the facial bones. Don't worry about that. All right, now this you probably do want to pay some attention to because you'll use it in your careers. The names of the vertebrae. Your vertebrae, singular vertebra, vertebrae, you have them in different regions. So we have our cervical vertebrae, and we usually refer to them by number. There are 7. C1 through C7. So you've heard of someone having a C-spine injury. That means that their spinal cord has been disrupted somewhere up in the cervical area and often has devastating paralysis that accompanies that. You've heard of a cervical collar. You see people, when they've had to wear one after a whiplash injury. So the cervical vertebrae, there are 7. Another fun fact for you trivia buffs. Ask someone how many cervical vertebrae they think a giraffe has. People guess huge numbers. They have 7 just like we do. It's just that they're bigger. So I'm going to do a little writing here. C, we have 7. 7 cervical vertebrae. The next ones that form the spine as it goes by your chest, what we typically call your upper back perhaps, those are the thoracic vertebrae, and there are 12 of those. They all have a rib attached to them. That helps you to remember that you have 12 ribs on each side. So T1 through T12, there are 12 thoracic vertebrae. Then we're down to the lumbar area, and if I had one to show you, they look like cinder blocks because they're carrying a lot of the weight of your body. The vertebrae get thicker and heavier and have cool different shapes. I wish we were teaching anatomy as you come on down, but there are 5 of those. 5 lumbar vertebrae. And I think, how am I going to remember that? Well, it's very easy. There's an old mnemonic for that, and you might like it. Back when people kept more reasonable hours, say back on the farm in the day, a lot of people ate breakfast at 7, lunch at 12, and supper at 5. So regular meal times were 7, 12, and 5. Not many of us are able to keep quite such regular hours these days, but that's the way you do the mnemonic. Some of my students in the past have come up with an even better way to add some more information to that mnemonic. If you had breakfast at 7, it might have been cereal. And if you had lunch at 12, you might have had a tuna sandwich or a taco. And you might have had lasagna for dinner. So you can think C7, T12, L5. And I think, but what's at the bottom after those lumbar vertebrae? Well, you have a sacrum, which is 5 fused vertebrae that make one big heavy bone. So you might think, well, after that lasagna, I was still hungry, so I had a sundae for the sacrum. And on top of that sundae, I wanted a big old cherry. So C stands for coccyx. So if you want to remember the elements of the human spine, you can think cervical vertebrae, thoracic vertebrae, lumbar vertebrae, sacrum, and coccyx or tailbone. It's kind of a fun one. No extra charge for that. All right, let's see. Moving on, we want to talk about what's in the upper limb or the upper extremity. The upper limb includes the shoulder girdle, which sounds funny. It's not like your grandma used to wiggle into. Girdle means a belt, and it's what holds the extremities onto the axial skeleton, the other part of the body. There's only 2 bones in the shoulder girdle. People are sometimes surprised. One is your clavicle or collarbone, and the other one is your scapula, commonly called the shoulder blade. Now, you don't really realize it just looking at a person with their skin and muscles on, but the only place where your upper extremity is connected to The rest of your body by bone is right there at that joint, at the acromioclavicular joint, or the joint where the collarbone joins your sternum, and then out here we have the AC joint. So those two joints are basically what hold your arm, your upper limb, onto your body. So you've probably heard of football players. My son was a defensive end. They lead with their shoulder. And you've heard of an AC joint separation. That stands for acromioclavicular. Now there's no acromial bone. The acromion is a little projecting piece of the scapula that allows it to join to the clavicle. So that's your upper girdle or your shoulder girdle, just two bones. The next big bone that forms the structure of this part of your arm is the humerus. And that's not spelled like funny. It's Humerus. Don't embarrass yourself. It's not humorous to misspell humerus. So Humerus. It has a ball-like head at the top that sits in a little cup called the glenoid fossa. You don't have to remember its name, but it's a very shallow cup. So if this was the head of my humerus and this is the part of my scapula that it articulates with or joins, the fact that this little cup is pretty shallow allows me to be able to do a lot of cool things with my arm. I can do a backstroke. I'm not talented at all, but I could do a backstroke with my tennis ball. If I could throw a ball, I do for my dog. I can really, even as an old lady, get a lot of motion here. So when we have a lot of motion, we pay for that with a lack of stability. So even though your shoulder is very talented at moving around, it's not so good at staying in place. And that's why we frequently hear about subluxation or dislocation at the shoulder joint. So we have the humerus, and then down below your elbow, we have two bones. On the thumb side, we have your radius, and longer but thinner on the pinky side, on the other side. What would we say if we were in the anatomic position? Think about that. Would it be lateral or medial? Think about the anatomic position. Okay, it's medial. We hold it up like this and you think, oh no, that's lateral, but remember the position you're in when you do the anatomic position. So the medial bone in the anatomic position is the ulna. How do you remember that? Well, if you see an ulna, the very top of it looks like a monkey wrench and it forms the letter U. It's so hard to do things backwards. U. There we go. The letter U. Then we come on down toward your hand, your wrist, which isn't where we in common language say our wrist is. We really wear our wristwatch or our bracelet or our Apple Watch on our distal forearm. Your wrist really is right across here and made up of carpal bones. The structure of your hand is your metacarpal bones, numbered 1 through 5 from the thumb side. The thumb has 2 bones in it. You probably noticed that when you looked at your hand, whereas your fingers have 3 bones. Good time to learn a new word if you haven't already. 2 new words, actually. I'm going to put them up. For some reason, this gives some students trouble. But we're going to work on it real quick. Proximal and distal. Let's talk about proximal first. Same root word as in approximate. If you say, how many people live in, I don't know, pick a city, wherever. How many people live in Hopkinsville? Well, I didn't count today, but if I were counting, I'd say approximately 30,000. What that means is I don't know, but it's not 1 million and it's not 2,000. So it's approximate. I'm like close to being right. I don't know how close, but pretty close to being right. Or if we say the suspect was still in the general proximity, we mean they didn't get very far. They're still close to where the crime was committed. So proximal means closer to the point of origin. And for extremities, that means closer to the central part of the body. We'll talk maybe later about other uses for that word, but get this one down first. So proximal means closer to the point of origin, closer to the center part of the body. Distal, well, same root as distant. A distant star is one that's far away, a long distance. How's your distance vision? That means far. So when we look at bones, and you can't see the bones in my hand, but you can see my fingers. If I have two bones in my thumb, the one closest to the rest of my arm is the proximal phalanx. That's the word for a finger or toe bone. And the one further away is my distal phalanx. I have two phalanges, one of those tricky plurals, in my thumb. My other fingers each have three phalanges, and I have a proximal one, a distal one, and an intermediate or medial one. So again, we start to learn those terms, proximal and distal, and you'll use them when you describe fractures. Very often children, when they fall off the monkey bars, get a fracture of the distal radius. That would be farther away from the elbow, farther away from the shoulder. And if you had a fracture of the proximal radius, which is not common, that would be up closer to the elbow. So the distal radius is out here, proximal would be here. So proximal and distal are two words that are used in healthcare over and over and over. And we may talk about them later on with regard to, say, your aorta or ureter. But for right now, if you will learn them in regard to bones, it will serve you well. Proximal and distal, two good terms to know. In the lower limb, we have a lower girdle that holds your leg on, that holds your lower extremity on. You can tell my Appalachian roots. So your lower limb consists of your hip girdle or your pelvic girdle, and that has the bones, and I'm going to write one of them up because I don't want you to make a fool of yourself making a mistake here. I don't want it to be my fault. You want to make sure that you spell the biggest of the hip bones correctly, because if you mess up one of the vowels, you'll be describing part of the small intestine, not the right thing. The big part of your pelvis, with that looks like the ear of an elephant, on each side you have an ileum. If you put an I in there, that's part of your small intestine, the part right before it goes into the colon, and you don't want to make that mistake. Different parts of the body, said the same way, but different parts. So your ilium, your ischium. If you've ever ridden horseback when you're not used to it, or gone out for a long bike ride when you haven't for a while and you were saddle sore, your ischium includes your sit bones and your pubis, which is the part in the front that holds your two hip bones together to form a complete bony pelvis. So those are the three bones that make up the lower girdle or the pelvic girdle. They hold on your lower extremity. And that leads us to our big old femur, the largest, strongest bone in the body. And why I wanted to talk to you before about how your shoulder joint works. Your hip joint's a little bit different. In your hip joint, you have a really good socket. The socket's called an acetabulum. It means vinegar cup. Don't ask me why. But your femur has a really big doorknob of a head that fits very snugly into that cup. So it's much less common to get a dislocated hip. It takes a lot more force than a dislocated shoulder. But again, we have that trade-off between flexibility and stability. So unless you happen to be some kind of gymnast or yoga master, you probably can't do the same kind of motion. If you're Simone Miles, you can, but the rest of us can't do the same things with our lower extremities in terms of flexibility that we can with our upper extremities. And I promise not to stand up and try to demonstrate that. So you have your femur, which is a big, strong bone. The next bone down is actually not attached to the other bones by a bony joint. It sits inside a tendon, and it's called your patella or your kneecap. And that would be the next important bone down, patella. In your leg proper, what we'd call our lower leg in plain English, but which is really your leg, you have two bones. Your tibia, which is your shin bone. If you'll reach down and feel, you can feel that the edge is very sharp, almost like a knife. And it's heavy, it bears weight. The bone beside it, laterally, is a little stick-like bone called the fibula. So we have a tibia and a fibula. Now let me tell you people, don't even think about mixing those two words together. That's called a portmanteau. You're like motel is a motor hotel. There you have a tibia and you have a fibula, and I'm not going to say it, and I don't want you to even think that you could mix up parts of those words. Students routinely used to write that on exams. It drove me nuts. Tell yourself as many times as you have to, tibia, fibula, and don't even think that weird combination you could make, that there ain't no such thing. All right, below that, the weight is transmitted down into what your book gives as pronunciation, talus. And some people say talus, some people say talus. It means a tablet. And below that is the big old heavy heel bone called the calcaneus. So you may have heard of the Achilles tendon. There's a movement in healthcare right now to get rid of eponyms or people's names or quaint names attached to various body parts. Talk for another day. Good reasons for that, but takes some of the fun out of it. So now we call that the calcaneal tendon, because what you may have known as your Achilles tendon attaches down there to your calcaneus. Just as we have metacarpals forming the structure of our hand, we have metatarsals, which have a nice arch if you're lucky. Actually 3 arches, one you can clearly see from the outside. An arch structure that, even though they're not very big bones, they can carry the weight of your whole body, like the dome of a cathedral. So you have your metatarsals, and then attached to them, we have the bones that make up your toes, which, thank you, Lord, are called phalanges again, just like your fingers. So we have, coming from the top down, we have our femur, the patella or kneecap, the tibia, the heavy bone, the fibula, the lateral stick-like bone that just provides stability, doesn't bear weight, the talus, the calcanea, then some tarsal bones that you don't need to worry about their names right now. The calcaneus and the talus are 2 of those, the metatarsals, and then the phalanges. And that's really pretty much all the bones, except for a few. 3 little bones in each middle ear. We'll talk about those when we get to ears. And another trivia question: what is the only bone in the body that isn't attached to any other bone anyway? And it's your hyoid bone. If you watch crime shows, you know that one of the ways they determine the person died by strangulation is that they fractured their hyoid bone. So your hyoid bone is a little bone that sits here and provides an attachment for the many hard-to-learn muscles that control your speech and your neck. I think that's about it for bones. It's been long-winded today, 2 parts. I think that's it. Remember, do your review questions. Those will help you with the quiz. They'll help you a lot. And I'll be back next week with muscles, which are pretty cool too. Bye.